But I think I'm here primarily because I'm a poet, I'm a writer. I have been a writer all my life, though I got more serious about it as time increased and I actually met other writers who are published and known for their work. A huge step along the way for me in doing that was when J. Otis Powell, one of my mentors, invited me to participate with Right on Radio on KFAI, which happened, oh gosh, is it 20 years ago? More than 20 years ago, I think now. And I got to interview writers. Initially, most of the writers were local people, but then we started interviewing international writers, and Jay Otis moved on from the show eventually, but I stayed with it, and we have a whole bunch of co-hosts now. And that was sort of my MFA program, was interviewing other writers. And then when I started teaching at Normandale Community College, I started meeting other people with MFAs, including one of my best friends, Chris Biak. And through those people, I learned how to become more of a professional in the writing situation, in the writing business. And so my first book, Approaching the Gate, was published by Holy Cow Press in 2014. I've got another one coming out in a few months, April of 2018. And I can say more about how I got to this place, but I think that's enough of an introduction for me.
Oh, how did I come to be doing what I do? So it was kind of a default, I think. I've always been in music. I always liked rock and roll. And so I tried to be an artist. I tried to go to school. I tried to do all that stuff to be a formal official, educated artist, blah, 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 academic thing. That didn't work. It all fell apart. So I kept falling back onto music. And after the last time I tried to go to MCAT, actually, and that didn't work, I fell back to music. And but then that exploded, and so I went back to art, and I established myself as a filmmaker and a performance artist down here in Minneapolis. And then one of my bandmates from my previous band that got me down to Minneapolis, actually, kept asking me about restarting the band, which we didn't do, but I did fall into music again, and then that's what I've been doing since. So, but I've been doing the art and performance art in addition to that. So primarily, most of my work is on stage, rock and roll and performance art, but primarily rock and roll, and visual work, paintings. Above that nobody can see is a big painting that I did, and various things. So, I'm trans. So I came to approach life circumstance through that lens, and that wasn't really a choice. That was just who I am. And over the course of my lifetime, I finally got comfortable with that and became fine with being public about that. It was a different story 30 years ago now, I figured out, and that was a different approach, but over 30 years, that identity as trans has changed and developed. So that aspect is in addition to the things I do creatively. So there we go.
And I don't know, I think we're just supposed to talk.
And also we're married.
We're married. We should mention we've been married since 1983. Mm-hmm. So this is the 34th year right now. I think it's, or actually maybe we're in the 35th year technically. Yeah. We completed 34. It remains to be seen whether we complete 35. No, just kidding. But I just wanted to piggyback on a couple of things that Venus was saying. So we got married in 1983, and I, as a writing person who loves the arts, who's always been attracted to the arts, I guess I would count myself a musician. And sometimes I used to do some visual art, particularly photography. Anyway, involved in the arts, and so I was very attracted to Venus because of Venus's involvement in the arts. We sort of made a good pair, lifestyle-wise, but Venus was closeted to themselves about being transgender, and so it took us about 5 years of marriage before you were able to say, this is who I am. And then, yeah, thank you for doing the math. It's been a 30-year process that keeps on changing a little bit over time. But that's what we've been doing. And I will also bring it back to being an artist. Venus's art career, how shall I put this? Sometimes has been frustrating to me, because it took up a lot of your time and energy and finances. I'll put it that way, in terms of the financial household issue. And it was frustrating to me because I was taking a much more conventional route. I went to graduate school and became an English professor so I could have a stable job teaching, having health insurance for the two of us, that sort of thing. And along the way, it felt as if I wasn't being recognized as a creative person by people kind of surrounding you, I would say. You recognized I was a creative person, but other people didn't. So I felt that I had to do more. And so it basically pushed me. And so, you know, when you were doing band rehearsals 2 or 3 nights a week, I got tired of sitting home waiting for you to come home. And so I said, okay, I'm going to go out to the poetry readings, and I'm going to participate in the poetry readings, and I'm going to be somebody who's a featured reader at the poetry readings. So, and ironically now, you got the idea a couple of years ago, I don't remember how, to write memoir, and I had been shirking that for a long time because it felt like I don't know if I can tell our story because it's not done yet. I don't know what the arc of it is. But after a couple of years of you working on memoir and people asking me why I wasn't doing it, I finally last summer said, the hell with it. I'm going to write memoir too. So now we're writing dueling memoirs. And we're, I think, still kind of in the early stages. I mean, we're both, or you've got a couple of set, almost finished pieces, but you don't have the whole thing, whereas I'm doing a big jumble and then I have to go back.
Well, we have different techniques.
Shaping.
I think different techniques of doing it. I'm very visual, so I did the whole timeline thing by creating this graph, this immense digital graph of everything that happened and getting the dates, linking it to the years, and I've decided on the time period that I'm writing about.
It's like a 20 megabyte Illustrator file. It's
huge. and so that's how I approached it. So I didn't do the journaling, and actually it's been about 10 years since I've been writing memoir focused essays, but I hadn't really drilled into, this is the piece I'm going to mold. I didn't know exactly where it was going to go. I had a blog for a while and I did that kind of stuff, and I didn't really have a timeline. I didn't have that. Well, now for me, I've got the timeline worked out. Chose that. I kind of have a sense of the arc, and I've finally come to developing a voice. So I'm kind of trying to work on the final essays, which I will eventually begin to really tighten. And I think for you, you're working on the timeline aspect, even though we're borrowing my timeline, sharing it. You're journaling, so you're kind of like doing everything in chronological to kind of get it into your head and to discover the story you want to tell.
Right.
But we're inspiring each other, not necessarily welcomingly, subjects and stories that we are telling from different perspectives.
It's causing us to experience painful parts of the past, which is kind of interesting. Something you thought you wouldn't have to do.
No, you made me have to write about things I didn't want to. So it's but I actually, I mean, it certainly is kind of when we started opening up some old things that we had kind of closed the door on, and having to look in and it wasn't cleaned up. You know, we had to clean house on those things. And you don't necessarily do that in a relationship. After you get through it and you shut the door, you don't go back. You're like, oh, I'm fine. We never have to talk about that again. Well, when we're doing this,
when you're a writer, you have to plumb that stuff.
Yeah. So and we have to do that. So we had to go back and open up those closed off rooms and clean it up and kind of say what was going on and what was from our position now, looking back, 10, 15 years, 20 years.
And I think we are going to have slightly different time periods and different messages, I think.
And so we think about how we got through the argument at the time or the situation at the time may be different than how we're remembering it or what we're willing to talk about now compared to back then.
Well, and it's just been really interesting, like trying to find it because of your timeline, trying to find any evidence that will support our memories of what happened when, because a lot of it involved travel and did we have this argument in New York City on this date, and was that before this happened, or was it after this happened? And
it alters the story, because if you just rely on memory, you will link the emotional roller coaster that you remember experiencing the way it makes sense, like you untangle the dream. You have a dream that happens, and then you just you glue it together and you make sense out of this jumble, which is a dream. But if you get the actual hard evidence, such as remembering the actual dream, not your reasoned memory of it, and similarly with the timeline where you have exact dates, then you find out that your emotional memory is not necessarily that accurate. That sometimes you think, oh, it just went from here to terrible, just blah. And then you go back and you look at the actual dates, and it's like, oh no, we had a really good time right here. And this was all right. We were doing okay and feeling pretty good about things. And then, this happened. And so it wasn't, and sometimes they're reversed. Our memory is like, no, this happened before this. And then we look at it and go, no, it happened this way. And then it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? How does that work? And so it's fascinating that the story that we remember that we've told ourselves has had to adapt to the reality of the dates that we've discovered.
Yeah.
You're kind of doing this to yourselves. I mean, it isn't like you don't have options. You've got half a dozen art forms you've encountered over the time, plus, public careers of various sorts. Why?
For me, the reason I started doing it was I felt, as a trans person, initially, because I said I started doing this about 10 years ago. Initially, I did it because I thought it was a valuable experience. And because I didn't make it into the public eye the way I had expected when I was younger and felt like I was doing something that, of course, the music industry would embrace and understand and see the value of. Well, they didn't. So we got to as far as we could, and then that was kind of laid out for us that they were not interested. We were too controversial. Being trans was too controversial back then. So I felt like I need to preserve this because it's not out there. I have to do the work, like I had to do the work all along. So for me, it was kind of I have to archive it. And then then the world changed, and then everything is okay, and being trans is actually an advantage. Now, who knew? And in the music industry,
only in some quarters.
yeah. So it was like, now it was a different reason. Now I'm living the change of the two worlds, the old world and the new world, and that's valuable. So I'm still approaching it like, feeling like this is an archival, important thing to document. On the other hand, it's my life and my experience and ours together, and I feel like I don't want that all to just evaporate and disappear. And then I'm also kind of obsessive about truth. So I want it accurate, which means the hard work that we have to do. Mm-hmm. But I've read memoir and I've listened to other people reading, and they fudged the truth in order to make the story interesting. And that always bothered me. I want it as close to the actual thing as possible, and not gloss over things. And that's a huge challenge and scary. But that's kind of coming from that archivist place, where I want it accurate. And I think it's important. I know a lot of trans kids now that I run into and meet, and they know me from my underground music history. They don't really know our history as trans people. They don't. They have an inkling of it, but it's so recent. And we're all, when we're in an activist place, we are in the moment and we're trying to strategize what we need to do to advance our issue farther now. And we kind of forget to look back and see where we were and what we've gone through. So I think that's important. Maybe not right now, but I think it will be. So.
I think that I have a unique story to tell. I think what's held me back for many years is that I didn't think anybody was interested in my story. But I know that usually when someone comes out as trans, they're usually married to somebody who wants to talk to me and find out how this worked for me. So I do.
Continually happens.
I do, yeah. I do. It's still happening, and I do. I do have a unique perspective. I guess that's, and I'm still, I'm still working on the memoir, so I don't have it completely articulated yet. Certainly, I don't know if I can talk about my spiritual path.
Sure.
I think a lot of my reaction is affected by my spiritual path in all of this. When I was growing up, I went to church. I was an Episcopalian. Loved the music and the architecture and just the general vibe. When I went away to college, I got lazy and didn't want to get up on Sunday mornings anymore. So I never fell away from the church. I just stopped going because I was lazy. And then when we got married, Venus didn't want to go to church. You had some very strong anti-church feelings, probably not just based on your personal experience, but also kind of what you were feeling inside. Even when you weren't out to yourself as transgender, you knew that you feared this kind of judgment from an establishment.
Well,
like
it's just a matter of belief too.
That
I mean,
too.
it comes down to just your core.
Right, but you're pretty strong about it as opposed to being, kind of, it's okay, I could take it or leave it.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, one huge stage when in our relationship, in our married life, after Venus had come out as transgender, was when you started publicly coming out. And I think the first public time to be out, well, the big one, I'm talking about being interviewed on Good Company.
Oh, God,
which was
yeah.
a local TV lifestyle show, basically, that aired here. on
Television media.
television.
not the old term. TV
Right. Television. Yes. Okay.
Transvestite.
So yeah. Okay. So anyway.
Old world.
Anyway.
Terms.
And you were going to be interviewed as part of a group called cross-dressers then.
Yeah.
And I was still in graduate school. I was finishing up basically teaching in the composition department as a grad student and turning in my grades, cleaning out my desk and moving things. I would be moving things cross campus to Learning and Academic Skills Center, where I had another teaching gig for a while. And I was deathly afraid that someone would see me and, oh, actually I'm thinking of a different thing. This is the memory problem. But if it's the same emotional crisis thing you were talking about. Okay, so I was very afraid then, somehow got through it, that was okay. The second emotional crisis I'm thinking about happened years later, when you were called in for jury duty.
Yeah, we'll get the timeline and figure it out.
I know. Is this 1995? Okay, so that's 1995. So Venus was called in for jury duty, and you answered the call because you thought, I'll do my civic duty, and you were dressed not like this, and this is probably before the hormones too.
I have to look at the timeline. I don't think it... I think actually it's early on in the hormones.
Okay. Well, to me, you didn't look like you were cross-dressing because you were wearing
No,
a
it
suit
was
and pants.
androgynous. Yeah.
But yeah, the jury people actually didn't recognize Venus by your male and legal name,
Right.
and there was kind of a kerfluffle about that. And then after you answered the usual jury questions, you left the room, and then a newspaper reporter happened to be in the room, and the two attorneys for the case called on the judge to make a ruling as to whether somebody who was transgender or cross-dresser was a protected class. Could you be instantly barred from the jury, or were you protected?
And it was there's another layer to that. The case was a case about somebody who had been accused of child molestation. So there was a sexual and sexuality element to the decision, and the person that approached the bench was the prosecutor, and they felt it was within their right to make an assumption based on my appearance that I would be seen as being biased in favor of somebody who was accused of child molestation. So it was even ickier. And the interesting thing is, in 1994, they had just passed a human rights amendment here, which included trans people. It was the first time in the nation, I found out, that trans people were included in a state's passage of that. And the lawyer, or not, the judge could have said this was an example that no, you can't do that because this group of people are now a protected class, but he didn't. He said, I think this is right, that you can make that assumption, and I was not a protected class. And the media and the reporters, instead of saying, wait a minute, I think you made a wrong ruling here, and debated that, they instead just thought, why would I not take advantage of this opportunity to get myself out of jury duty? And they didn't see the seriousness.
Well, anyway, the
I'm
judge,
going down and down and down. This is another subject. You're talking.
Right.
You talk.
So the point is that that there was a news story that came out unbeknownst to us, and like page 3 of the Star Tribune, banner headline all across the page. Judge rules that cross-dressing jury member can be barred from jury, something like that. And we didn't know that this article was going to appear. I was probably in my second year of my tenure track teaching job at Rochester Community College, and I didn't have tenure yet. And we found out about this because a friend of ours called us up early in the morning and said that the KQRS radio disc jockeys were making fun of us because your name was there. I don't think my name was there, but it said I was an English professor. I mean, it, basically stuff that was part of the public record. It said, and I thought, oh my God, I'm not supposed to be discriminated against, but I didn't have tenure. They could come up with something, one student evaluation out of place or, whatever. So, I was in crisis mode, and that's when the whole point I started on this tangent is that's when I got more involved in spirituality, basically. I was crying. I needed, I was looking for some kind of community where people didn't hate and make fun of each other. I wanted a community where people loved each other. And I did what I often do when I'm stressed out. I went shopping at a thrift store just to look at stuff. And I ran into this old man there who was really sweet and just started talking to me about stuff. And I didn't tell him what I was going through at all, but he wanted someone to have a conversation with. And he used to play the organ at St. Mark's Cathedral, which is a couple blocks away from there. So he told me all about that. And I'd been to St. Mark's a couple of times. It was an Episcopal church, and it wasn't quite what I'd grown up with, and so I wasn't ready to go back to it. But I thought, this maybe is what I need. So I went and I stayed, and so through that I've just done a lot of study of spiritual things, not just Episcopalianism, a lot of Buddhism, and now I do a lot of what do you call the stuff I do with Kari touring?
Nordic.
Well, it's Nordic roots, kind of pre-Christian circumpolar spirituality as well. She does rune singing, and she and I have done a number of shows together, and I sort of use our shows together as an opportunity to force myself to write new work. So, it's I don't know if I guess I could call it similar to an indigenous spirituality. It's an indigenous spirituality of cold weather, basically is what it is, which means that, you need to kind of read your environment and kind of figure out how to be in balance with your environment. So that has tremendously affected how I've negotiated our relationship since I started going down that path. So I think that's going to have to be in the memoir too, but I have not even been able to figure out how to write about that yet.
I'm imagining this getting published the way some of these books are, with one right side up and the other one upside down glued to it. Do you have this in mind? Or interpolate, or maybe like the New Testament with the parallel Gospels.
Oh,
You could
We have had people when they mostly Lynette's academic colleagues or
What's
friends.
it called? Talmud commentary.
Yeah.
But we've heard lots of people with ideas once they know we're writing memoirs, our own ideas about similar timelines, and with all kinds of different ideas and suggestions. And I think we want to release them independently of together, but I think it could be I'm sure they will be connected, but I don't think I think we're going to try to do it as two individual independent releases, but other people will package them.
Yeah.
Well, is there, it's an English teacher question maybe, but is there precedent for this?
I don't know.
Has anybody else ever done
There have been
memoirs?
There has been a subject. There was a memoir double where I'm forgetting now, but the author wrote a memoir about his son who was going through a psychotic episode and treatment for schizophrenia. I believe that's how it was, or was it?
Well, I think I know what you're talking. And then the son has written the memoir. That's
memoir.
Yeah, and I think there is actually precedent for people doing this in families. I'm thinking of my good friend Emily. She comes from a family of writers, and a lot of what they do is write about each other. I don't think it's happened lately. But
I don't think there's a formal genre for
Right.
it.
But I think that, you know,
and for us, it just kind of happened.
when people are in relationship, and a lot of writers are in relationship with each other in some way or another, it can happen. And it's tricky because people can feel as if they're being used.
And maybe that's why you decided to write.
Yeah.
So that you felt like you had. Although she did read some of my early work because she was threatening to write a memoir of herself when she understood I was actually serious about it. And then I let you read one of my first things, and it had involved a big argument, and you read it, and then you said, "Okay, you're pretty accurate." So I wasn't.
Here it is, recorded.
Yeah.
I said Venus was pretty accurate.
Yeah.
There it is.
Meaning that I had balanced it well enough so she didn't feel like I was misrepresenting her.
Right.
So I think that kept you from feeling a need to do that. But I think, yeah, like you said, other people were really pushing you or asking you to do it. And I think it's great. And it is. Yeah, so I think it's important.
It's an interesting emotional exercise, I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering kind of about the media question here. I mean, you've got so many media accessible between you. I remember on a train from Munich to Berlin watching 4 little girls make friends. They were seated in, those things where you have 2 chairs and 2 chairs on the other side, and they were interacting over a period of about 7 hours. It was a long trip. And it came away, especially in a German context where people are reserved, is maybe putting it a bit mildly, thinking that if we could, transfuse what those kids had to the rest of the train or the rest of Germany, we would solve most of the German problem because of how it flowed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're writing about a marriage, a lot about a marriage, and a lot about difficult things in a marriage, and you're writing it as 2 independent accounts. And I'm just remembering that what I valued was a lot of little moments when somebody did exactly the right thing that, as a socially dysfunctional person, I never would have done. I'm just wondering about this media business. In other words, how does one tell a story of a marriage well?
It's I don't know. I guess if we get far enough along and get editors or publishers interested, then they'll tell us.
Well, I have a short answer, at least what I'm trying to work at. I'll put it that way. I don't know if this is the answer, but what I find myself doing is writing about events, and I'm a very what should I say? A person who wants to know what causes what causes what causes what. And so I'm doing it mostly chronologically, but then of course I have to circle back because I remember, oh, this is because of this. And then when I go back and reread, I find that the best parts are where I'm talking about my feelings. And I have a tendency to not talk about my feelings, perhaps like many of those people on that train car in Germany, because I'm trying to protect them. I don't want to be seen as a fool or overly, I don't know, light, L-I-T-E, or whatever, right? Or maybe overly egotistical even. But when I reread what I've initially journaled on, I discover that when I do bother to talk about my feelings and get more introspective about them, that is where the interesting stuff lies. So I think that sort of there has to be a balance of what actually happened, but then the examination of feelings is really, really important as well.
Yeah, I would say that for me, writing is a new art form. I know visual art and music and lyric and performance. I know all of those art forms, but writing has been a different new experience for me, and I think it's probably taken me all of those 10 years to develop and understand and get comfortable with it. But yeah, it's and particularly in memoir, you're telling a story based on facts, and you have to find the connections and the emotions behind the chronological timeline is what's important. And so when we talk and in rock and roll and stuff, it's not who you meet, it's not that, it's what you were thinking when these experiences happened. You're giving a reader a chance to get into your skin and look through your eyes. And so you need to invite them into your brain and your thought process. And I think that's the story and what makes people interested. It's not just the experience.
Yeah.
It's not a bibliography or an autobiography or that kind of thing. It's a story. It's an experience. So yeah, I think that's where that's how to tell a marriage, maybe, because the marriage holds together because of the emotion. It doesn't hold together because of the circumstance or the experience so much as the emotion that threads everything together.
And what I'm hearing is that, truth matters to both of you, truth in the sense of, the boring sense of getting the dates right,
Yeah.
and in other senses as well. Whatever is involved in you showing each other the story and taking seriously what happens. And I know that sometimes it's really important for people to have a line on things to get through the day, to have a line on the stages of their life, to have a line on the transformations they went through, to have a line on the nature of their relationship. And sometimes, you almost, when you ask somebody about one of these matters, you almost push a button and get quite literally a recording. It's the set piece. I'm just wondering, do you have a temptation or an attraction to a simpler story? To some fairy tale or other that would get like 90% of it?
Well, if this project works, I would love to keep writing other stories, take other overlapping stories, or maybe dig into one story or something that is outside of that timeline. It's a fascinating technique and writing, but I don't know if I want to simplify it. I would love to do a chapter in graphic novel form, which would have to simplify that section, but I don't want to do that for the whole thing. And it may not happen at all. That might be a whole different project. But no, I don't know if I want anything simple
I think I'm hearing your question a little bit differently.
Okay, you go ahead.
And I think the answer is yes, when I'm trying to explain things to other people. I do have a strong desire to simplify the story, and I usually do simplify the story because I don't want to be stuck in long explanations. And it's only been very recently that I've decided it's better to not simplify the story even when I'm in conversation with people. So recently I've started referring to you as my spouse instead of my husband, though I think of Venus as my husband just as because of our long relationship together, our long history together. And I'm just trying to think. Sometimes I'm coming out to my students. I don't like to, I always look for like, is there a relevant situation in which I should mention to my students that my spouse is transgender? Sometimes I do that with students. I do that more with people who aren't students. I just try a little, and then the other thing is that in terms of my poetry, I've found transgender to be a difficult word poetically. and so, you know, like most of the language around this just doesn't sound very poetic. And so it's only been in the last couple of years that I felt as if I can use those statements in my poems. And part of it was, I was trying to simplify the story. And so I would use terms, and I think you called me on it when you would say, you know, people are expecting me to look one way when you say your husband. They don't recognize me. And you know, or when I'm describing something that happened in a poem, you know, you're saying, well, you're not telling the whole story. It's okay if you show me in a bad light, but you're not telling the whole story if you don't reveal that, you know, I was also dressed up wearing high heels, for example. And so I found that difficult to do poetically. I mean, because it just didn't seem as if there was enough of a precedent, and it's meant standing out with something. And I think my take on it is different than yours, because this is kind of your life. My life is different, and so I feel like I have to somehow express your life in my life. And it's always been easier to tell the conventional story because it's what people are expecting, and it's been harder to find the right words to tell the unconventional story.
There aren't sort of story models for it.
Right.
It's breaking some new ground. I mean, it's not just us. It's like it is the era of that. So a lot of people are thinking beyond the standard as they're talking. The whole thing now, where if you have a gathering, a public gathering or a group of people in a small enough setting, you ask their gender pronoun preferences.
Right.
That's like,
that's brand new.
Yeah, that
at least
I couldn't
brand new to my
imagine
community.
that ever happening 20 years ago, let alone when I came out 30 years ago. It was like this. It's amazing, but it's the new world, and it's like expected to happen. And when you don't, I mean, I've been in a leadership position with some creative positions that I've done, and so I have to direct or work with a group of people, and I forget to do that because it's just not part of my world. And I think, oh, I'm trans, I don't have to worry about this. You know, I'm way ahead of the curve. No. If I don't do that, I get called on it, and I can see people struggle if they are identifying differently, gender-wise, but they are mistaken because I didn't set up the safety of letting them say ahead of time or ahead of a group conversation how they prefer to be referred to. gender-wise.
Oh, and just in my classroom, I now have
Yeah.
a statement in my syllabus that says basically you can use they as a singular, non-gender specific pronoun in this class, which is huge in a freshman composition class, and then also in that I state that I will ask you what your preferred gender is when we're going around doing introductions, class introductions. So I did that just fine fall semester. This semester, I just realized after my second class, we forgot to do that. I was going through the syllabus, it's like, oh, I forgot to do this, so I'm gonna have to come up with another way of doing that. But when I did it in the fall, the students were so happy that I did it. Because actually many of them were already used to that. They're way ahead of me on that. So yeah, it's just, but my brain, hasn't quite fallen into doing that automatically yet.
So in writing and creative construction of storytelling and things like that, doing that extra explanation about the more diversity of a relationship or circumstance relating to how we see ourselves and how we present ourselves to each other, I think will at some point become like, okay, you are, what's the rest of the story? How should I make assumptions here with this information? Give me the rest of the story. But we're still in that early stage where if we don't give that story, then people default to a standard image.
It's not just with transgenderism. I've been teaching a book for the last year and a half in my freshman comp classes called A Good Time for the Truth, Race in Minnesota, which has been a wonderful book. It's a collection of essays written by, I think they're almost all, if not completely all, local writers, people of color, various communities of color, representing just all kinds of different life experiences, and they're writing their experience with race in Minnesota. And it's worked really well as a book to teach in Bloomington, Minnesota, with a predominantly white suburban clientele. At least that's what they appear to be. But once they start reading these personal essays, it gives them an opportunity to come out as well and say, well, here's what my family structure is like, my little brother is African American, stuff like that, and when we make an assumption based on appearance that, oh, you're just a white person in the mainstream, it gives them an opportunity to say, well, actually, I'm not, I don't correspond to that. And many years ago, when I was in graduate school, when I was doing research with a good friend of mine, we were basically kind of exploring literature of American minorities and trying to bring it into the canon of what people read. And she, in her experience, she was from a family from North Dakota, white woman. What she discovered was that in her family, things that didn't fit the standard narrative were simply left out of the standard narrative. So, for example, I think in her family, I don't know if it was an uncle or what, his wife had passed away. He was not able to take care of the child, so the child was raised by some other family member, and nobody ever talked about who the child really was. In other words, it had to conform to this very conventional narrative, and I think that is what whiteness does to a society. It says that basically we don't talk about the parts that are not something that we're proud of or fits in the mainstream. We're going to all identify in this one particular way. And it means that people are completely detached from their history, from their families, from their experiences. And so this whole movement about coming out in terms of gender, sex, race, all of this stuff, I think is really healing for everybody.
It brings it back to the truth. This is the
Yeah.
truth of our existence. Our humanity is very diverse and very complex. And when we pretend it isn't,
That's where the
we're
pain
not
comes
telling
from.
the truth.
Yeah.
So I think this is really important as well. Oh, so many things are important. I just keep saying that. This is all important.
Well, it's also emergent, and that must be a hard thing for, at least for a teacher, and maybe for anybody who interacts, to make sense of. I mean, there isn't much of a fact of the matter about race when one nails it down. It's a bizarre notion that, but there's more of a fact of the matter to be confessed about race than at a particular age there may be about gender identity. I mean, one answer to the question how should I be cast is I don't know. And traditionally, although it's sort of unfortunate that all the hard work gets loaded on the English teachers, or more specifically on the composition teachers, but traditionally, one of the places where one explores things one doesn't know is in the context of composition. I mean, the thing one does is write about it. Well, am I really always that different from this person who's decided they're non-binary? What does that mean? And I mean, it's not like I can go get one of these little $24 tests and know. So what do you do with that? I mean, you're in a position, you're both in one way or another in kind of mentoring positions. I mean, you're both in a position to talk to people who don't know what they are.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how that works for you.
Well, I think I try to be myself as much as possible, and I make myself available to any questions. And I try to communicate what was communicated to me when I began to try to understand who I was, and that was that anything is there. Anything is possible. It is up to you to find and define, and but you have a lot of resources to work with. And it's hard because you can't really you can't bring people along their path. They have to go on their own. But you can give personal experience to help maybe offer them possibilities of consideration as they look towards where they're going. And I think just artistically, just doing that in the art form as well, encapsulating all of that as a resource separate from your physical self is important way to do it.
For students, actually, I don't think I've experienced students not knowing who they are. They don't know what to do, oftentimes, and a lot of that indecision is hemmed in by fear, not feeling safe, not feeling socially safe, not feeling financially safe, that sort of thing, not feeling psychologically safe. Not feeling competent, that sort of thing. So I think, the people I interact with are going to be different than the people who are seeking insight from you. And so what I try to do is set up a safety situation for them, basically a safety net, and depending on how much they're willing to disclose. You know, there's a reason professors have offices with doors. So if a student needs to tell you something really emotionally significant, they can close the door and have a good cry about it. I think that the what you're saying also is similar to any advice that I do give students when they ask for it, which is just to tell my own story. That's about all you can do, is tell your own story or tell the stories you know of somebody else who's been in similar circumstances. And yeah.
You said something that I can relate to with what I do too on stage. If I'm doing performance art or rock and roll, but I will try to create a safe place for us to be honest with each other. And I do that in a variety of ways, but I know in performance art I will make myself vulnerable. And that act of vulnerability creates a safe place. I'm not sure exactly how it does, but it opens something and it creates a sense of safety for the audience. And when I've done it right, I will hear from people later who will open up to me and tell me their stories. I'm not asking them to, but they feel moved to because they feel like I'm a safe person to confide in. And that happens on rock and roll too, where maybe that vulnerability is in a different form. In performance art, it's almost it can be a physical thing. In rock and roll, it becomes a more emotional thing in that it's lyric. It's touching somebody emotionally with the vulnerability of lyric, and a representation of a story being told through lyric. And a similar thing will happen often where people will later want to confide in me or tell me their story because they feel empowered, perhaps, or they feel a need to ground what they're thinking with someone who would understand. And I've had all of those things happen throughout my career as an artist, and it's very moving and very humbling, and it is it's very humbling.
And poetry can be like that too. Yeah, definitely.
So the art, the performance, the poem invites people to talk to you.
If the vulnerability is there, I think.
And actually, I think that might be one of the reasons why I like doing readings. I do probably more readings than your average poet. I don't stay at home and write all by myself. In fact, for me, giving a reading with people around is part of my process to see if the poem feels right to say and catches the audience, tells them something they need to hear, that kind of thing, or want, feel better about hearing. So frequently I've had people come up to me after readings and mention a particular thing that caught them, either the subject matter or the phrase or whatever it was, and it spoke to something that's going on in their lives, basically. Especially the relationship poems, that clearly is something that people connect with. And I've done a lot of poems kind of plumbing my past heritage, either imagined heritage or actual heritage that can be traced, as little as it can be traced. I've had people feel as if I've struck an emotional chord with them that they needed to have pulled out of them, I think.